I'm Kenneth Welsh, with more fascinating stories on Northern Mysteries. Spiritualism is the art of communicating with those who have passed on. The practice began in the United States in the mid-19th century. It quickly spread to Canada, then to Europe. Spiritualism was the subject of many scientific experiments back then. Using approaches that were often quite ingenious, researchers attempted to prove that these dialogues with the spiritual world were real. One of these scientists, Canadian Thomas Glendenning Hamilton, quickly became a leading figure in this field. The night was still young when the car pulled up in front of an elegant home on Henderson Boulevard in an upper-class neighborhood of Winnipeg known as Westgate. It was a two-story, Dutch-style home, typical of upper-class society. In spite of the lights, the visitors can see that there is no one in the rooms on the first floor. But the man knew better. In fact, you might say that there were more guests than the number of people invited. The visitor joined a group that was gathered in a specially arranged room on the second floor. Men and women were seated on chairs in a horseshoe pattern. Behind the guests were a dozen or so cameras, all pointed at the group. The cameras were all linked to a remote control button. A small wooden table was placed in the middle of the room. In silence, all of the participants joined hands and pressed their feet against those of the person next to them to form a human chain. The strange seance was about to begin.
Oh, spirits, friends from the great beyond, do you wish to communicate with us? My friends, are you there?
Suddenly, a noise could be heard. It sounded like a piece of furniture was wobbling on its legs. As a flash went off, the participants stared in wonder. The table was floating upside down, a meter off the ground. Everyone had the same thought. I hope that picture turns out. In the post-World War I era, as some 8 million victims were being buried, interest in psychic research and communications with the spirit world was mounting as never before. In France, the International Metapsychic Institute was carrying out a series of experiments led by Dr. Charles Richet, the 1913 Nobel Prize winner in the field of medicine. In Canada, another physician, Dr. T.G. Hamilton, was also wading into this controversial field of research.
Dr. Glenn Hamilton was one of those really interesting people who was born in Ontario and eventually ended up in Manitoba and became a doctor out there. He had an illustrious career. He was a member of the Manitoba legislature, involved in the medical school at the University of Manitoba, and probably Canada's most famous psychic researcher in the 1930s. A friend of his, Dr. Abbott, who was at the University of Manitoba in the English department, went down to the United States to see a phenomena where a woman, through Ouija boards, was receiving information from a woman called Patience Worth. And over a period of time, this Patience Worth translated from the other side, from the spirit side, whole books, poetry, novels at a tremendous rate. Dr. Abbott came back and talked to Hamilton about it, and I think that was in 1928, and at that point the spark of interest happened.
Thomas Glendinning Hamilton became interested in psychical research because his son had died as an infant around the end of the First World War, and I believe that he was not able to get over the death, and so ended up investigating life after death in order to find out what had happened to his son.
Hamilton set up a laboratory in a large room on the second floor of his home on Henderson Boulevard. He was aware of the importance of taking photographs during the seances. They would be vital to supporting his research.
Hamilton had arranged a series of cameras along with automatic flashes that would be able to be set off in the complete darkness to try and record some of these manifestations. Some were stereo cameras, some were arranged to take different perspectives, some were arranged to take specific close-ups, but the idea was to try and photograph these manifestations in complete blackness, and was able to produce some remarkable photographs of objects apparently emanating from the mouths, the noses, the ears of the medium.
This element is ectoplasm, a substance that is given off by mediums and which makes up the human body and various objects. In the 1920s, Hamilton and his colleagues studied all phenomena associated with spiritual communications, but especially manifestations of ectoplasm. Abiding by his own rules, Hamilton only called upon non-professional mediums, volunteers that he knew personally who agreed to abide by all of his control measures. Upon arrival, the medium would be searched to make sure that no strange substances were being brought into the laboratory. Once inside the room, the medium asked to hold the hands of the individuals sitting on either side. For the duration of the experiment, the medium's hands never left those of the guardians. And while the medium was in a trance, spirits would manifest themselves by means of ectoplasm.
I think part of the attraction is the picture itself. There's still a profound respect for the picture that's worth 1,000 words. And people believe pictures. You see things in the exploitive press, and as long as there's a picture there, people will believe. He was a doctor. Doctors had a profound position in the community, and still do, as people of honesty and integrity. He was a member of the provincial legislature. And so, in fact, I think he himself was believable. The fact that he dealt with photographs meant what he researched could be looked at and separated from him, and the picture itself became the statement of his truth. And he was allowed to do this research without personal attack.
Between 1928 and 1933, T.G. Hamilton organized dozens of such seances. Guests came from all over the world to attend these experiments, including novelist Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who created the famous Sherlock Holmes, and William Lyon Mackenzie King, the future Prime Minister of Canada.
It wasn't just lawyers and doctors, as we know, were involved, but it was also even the Prime Minister of Canada in the 30s, when William Lyon Mackenzie King in the early 30s became interested in the question of survival and spirit communication.
Although the seances and the photos convinced Hamilton and his companions that the soul lives on after death, many believe that his experiments were just a hoax.
I think it's quite clear that Hamilton himself believed very strongly, and I don't think that he would participate knowingly in any fraud. Some of the photographs look extremely suspicious, and certainly there is the notion that there was fraud going on in those circles of investigative circles at that time.
He was serious about what he was doing. He tried to do the investigations with very strict scientific methodology. And yet one must wonder, from looking at some of the photographs and the samples of writing that were produced, why some of these things that appear to be hoaxes or could be easily hoaxed were believed so intensely by the individuals involved.
All of the people who were directly involved in the research, were convinced of the authenticity of the research, including many years later. In some cases, 30, 40, 50 years later, people were still writing positively about their experiences. There's a number of other prominent physicians and politicians who were involved and testified that the mediums did not appear to be bringing anything into the room, nothing left the room. The room itself was secured so that there was no possibility of someone entering and depositing something that could be taken out later and pretended to be a manifestation. So there were some very good scientific restrictions and some good methodology in trying to study what was occurring to prevent hoaxing, and yet the possibility of a hoax can never be ruled out.
At the end of each seance, a record of what was observed was signed by all of the participants. It seems highly unlikely that all of these individuals would have signed if the seances had been a hoax. Skeptics claim that it would have been more worthwhile to get a sample of ectoplasm for analysis, rather than simply photographing it. They also question why mediums no longer produce this ectoplasm that used to be so popular.
Teleplasm was very interesting phenomenon. It was widespread at the time that it was in vogue, if we might say that, and oftentimes the teleplasm would have images of people and things inside the teleplasm. Now I think the people look at the teleplasm and it looks completely ridiculous.
Today we largely want to be entertained. We've become used to the radio, the television, and most recently video games and the internet. And to sit night after night, week after week, for months on end to develop this type of phenomena is extremely boring. And this is what the mediums, the Hamilton mediums, reported. They were bored. They did not want to continue meeting for such lengths of time and not really knowing what was going on. They weren't aware of the phenomena that was being produced in many cases.
I think the fact that so many of these effects, such as automatic writing and ectoplasm and teleplasm, can be duplicated by stage magicians, has sort of put these on the back burner. I think because they can be easily duplicated and can be so easily hoaxed, that people want more solid physical evidence.
Spiritualism has changed quite a bit since the days when T.G. Hamilton did his experiments, to the point where the practice of levitating tables has practically disappeared. Nowadays, mediums channel energy directly from the spiritual world, hence they are known as channelers. But one thing has not changed over the years, and that's our insatiable desire to maintain close contact with loved ones who have passed on. That desire may not necessarily be a rational one, but it does make us human. At the end of the 19th century, within the space of a few years, spiritualism went from a marginal belief to a fashionable pastime, practiced by the upper middle class. Participants included intellectuals and artists, of course, but also royalty such as Queen Victoria and several high-ranking political figures of the time. There was an unusual silence in the large home on Laurier Avenue in Ottawa. This huge three-story dwelling, which was usually teeming with servants and guests, seemed to be empty at the moment, or close to it.
give us a sign. Knock once for no and twice for yes. Do you wish to communicate with us? We got the power. For several months, I've been thinking to resign from the Liberal Party. Should I do it? The unemployment is still very high, all across the country. Will the labor program proposed by Mr. Bennett change something?
There's a reason why this man seems so interested in Canadian politics. Our medium is none other than William Lyon Mackenzie King, leader of Canada's Liberal Party. In 1908, as Mackenzie King began to rise within the Liberal Party, there was no indication that he would become seriously involved with spiritualism. A bachelor who was very close to his mother, King led a very austere lifestyle.
During the First World War and just after, the family began to fall apart. The family wasn't what it used to be. Father died, mother died, brother died, sister died. And so this family, which was the only place that Mackenzie King ever felt truly comfortable, was now down to almost nothing. He felt very, very lonely.
The loss of his mother really hit him hard. He was deeply grief-stricken by his mother's death. And after her death, Spiritism came to fill an important void in his life.
I see some people just around you. There's a woman. An old woman.
It was not unusual to have these interests. And again, we have to emphasize that it was not, in Mackenzie King's mind, anti-religious. It was simply another vehicle for trying to get in touch with the world that we couldn't quite explain.
I see some transformation.
March 1925. Mackenzie King, who was becoming more and more interested in the occult sciences, consulted a psychic in Kingston, Ontario, named Rachel Bleney.
I feel celebration.
The medium predicted that he would win the election of October 1925 by a landslide. Once he was re-elected, Mackenzie King began to put all of his faith in the power of mediums.
Everyone who's ever studied Mackenzie King is sure that he wasn't really so much interested in the messages that came from the spirit world as he was in feeling that his loved ones were looking out for him. They were looking over him. He'd always been attracted to certain numbers, or to perhaps finding reassurance in one way and another. We'd call it superstitions.
During one session of the House, he had been sitting at his desk in his seat, and he noticed that several conservatives were missing. Because of the way the seats were laid out with regard to the empty seats, he managed, by applying some mental gymnastics that are rather hard to describe, to derive the number 30 from the way the members of Parliament were distributed among the seats. And so, from then on, the number 30 acquired a certain importance in his life.
In 1930, Mackenzie King lost the election. With less public responsibilities, Mackenzie King now had more time to dedicate to what he referred to as psychic research. However, discretion was still necessary.
His closest advisor saw what he was doing, and Skelton wrote in his diary that this was political dynamite. This had better not get out, or Mackenzie King's reputation would be mud.
In 1948, William Lyon Mackenzie King withdrew from the public arena. But up until the end of his life, he had a special connection with the spiritual world. Several of his experiences with the occult were written in his journal.
Mackenzie King had asked that this diary be destroyed, especially the passages having to do with certain aspects of his private life. Among other things, his involvement in Spiritism. It's fairly easy to guess that that's what he wanted to lead it. His heirs could not agree on what was to be done, because there were no clear political guidelines on protecting privacy at the time, so tampering with the document was out of the question. The journal has remained intact and has been studied by a number of historians. Today, it is available on the internet, on the Government of Canada website, and in the National Archives of Canada.
On July 22, 1950, Mackenzie King died peacefully in his antique bed on Kingsmere Estate. After a lifetime dedicated to the Canadian people, he could now join the spiritual world that he had contacted so often in the past. So ended the double life led by Mackenzie King.
A man named Kaiserlink, who was a very good historian from the University of Ottawa, who wrote an interesting article in the Journal of Canadian Studies about Mackenzie King and the spirit world. And essentially what he was saying was, how is it possible to lead a double life? How can you be so interested in the world beyond the material world at night and then put it completely aside during the day? It must have had an impact.
I think that spiritist seances, these beliefs in spirits and the hereafter and so forth, I don't think they ever in the least way influence his political thinking, especially during the war, because during that period in his political career, he'd renounced all ties to Spiritism.
Despite the research carried out by Dr. T.G. Hamilton, the strong interest in the field by leading public and political figures, and the scientific progress made, there's still no concrete proof that the spiritual world exists. In 150 years of dialogues with spirits, no one has ever produced solid proof that these spirits are real. With his usual tongue-in-cheek humor, Woody Allen once said, "I don't believe in the afterlife, although I am bringing a change of underwear." A wise precaution. Fantastic encounters, enigmatic disappearances, strange truths, and fabulous legends. Maybe someone can finally reveal the truth behind these extraordinary mysteries. And maybe that someone is you. I'm Kenneth Welsh with more Northern Mysteries. Gold. Men have always been fascinated by this precious metal, from Egyptian pharaohs to Aztec emperors. But towards the end of the 19th century, there was a real gold rush. Thousands of adventurers traveled the world in search of gold, from the deserts of South Africa to the heights of the Rocky Mountains. Based on a few simple rumors, dozens of prospectors headed into the Alberta Highwood Mountains looking for Jack Lemon's lost mine. To the southwest of Calgary, in the foothills of the Canadian Rockies, the Highwood River flows through the Highwood Mountains. The countryside is so beautiful here that it attracts nature lovers, adventurers, and treasure seekers. It's said that in the heart of the Highwood Mountains lies one of the richest sources of gold deposits in Canada, the lost mine of Frank Lemon.
The Lost Lemon Mine is one of Alberta's great lost treasure stories. It began in 1870 when a group of prospectors headed out from Tobacco Plains in Montana with the goal of doing some prospecting for gold up around the North Saskatchewan River. Along the way, two of those prospectors, by the name of Blackjack and Lemon, split off from the main party, began to head out on their own. We don't really know who Frank Lemon or who Blackjack were. There are lots of anecdotal stories, there are lots of earlier newspaper reports and people claiming to have known them. But in terms of exactly where they came from and where they disappeared in time, at this point we don't really know.
Near the Purcell Mountains, Frank Lemon and the Métis Blackjack entered a lush valley where streams meandered from the mountains, carrying fresh, clear water. They noticed something shiny in the water, sparkling gold. Eureka! At the surface of the water and all around them, rocks were lined with streaks of gold. They had struck it rich. That night, Lemon and Blackjack were faced with a dilemma. Should they begin prospecting immediately, or head to town to stake a claim? Lying on his sleeping bag, Frank Lemon couldn't stop thinking about the events of the day. I wonder how much all this gold is worth. 100,000? 500,000? 750,000? Figures danced in his head. $750,000 divided by 2 equals... But why should I have to share it? There was no reason for him to share the wealth. This gold was his, and he fully intended to keep it for himself.
Again, you know, the story is about death, murder, intrigue, all these things that one finds in a kind of a mystery like this. And in the legend, the dispute ends when Lemon kills Blackjack, heads south into Montana, down to the Jesuit mission, and becomes somewhat unbalanced by the experience.
Unknown to the prospector, his crime did not go unseen. A few meters away, William and Daniel Bendow, 2 members of the Blackfoot tribe, had been observing him from behind the bushes. At daybreak, the Bendow brothers returned to the Morley Reserve, where they told Chief Bearspaw what had happened during the night.
I saw them kill him on sacred land last night.
He was afraid that the white man's discovery would lead to a gold rush. He instructed the Bendow brothers to return to the river and hide any traces that would allow other prospectors to identify the spot.
The death of Blackjack was blamed on some renegade Blackfoot Indians, and when Lemon came back to civilization, he blamed it on the Blackfoot, and shortly after that, a mountain man by the name of John McDougall was dispatched to bury the unfortunate Blackjack. John McDougall did that and was later hired to take a subsequent group of prospectors out to the site, but he stopped in Fort Kip, Montana on the way, and as part of the legend, apparently drank himself to death and was never able to show anybody the site of the gold. Frank Lemon, after murdering Blackjack, was never able to find the mine again. He tried numerous times to return to the location, and every time he got close, he seemed to get more and more agitated. And as a result, was never able to find the mine, was never able to clearly tell anybody exactly where the gold was hidden. And as a result, the mystery just grew as he got older.
Over the years, the search for Frank Lemon's lost mine became an obsession for a handful of prospectors. One of them, Lafayette French, spent the last 15 years of his life looking for the mysterious River of Gold.
Lafayette French was an interesting character. He was supposedly the man who had grub-staked, who had financed both Blackjack and Lemon's expedition. After Lemon had claimed to have found gold and after the death of Blackjack, Lafayette French spent the rest of his life looking for the gold. In fact, some people in the Waterton Lakes area joke that the Waterton Lakes were the result of him digging so many holes for gold that eventually filled up with water and formed the lakes. But at one point he wrote a letter to a friend claiming to have finally solved the mystery of the Lost Lemon mine. But before he could tell anybody where it was, he was fatally burned when the cabin in which he was sleeping burned to the ground. So once again, the story had claimed another victim. When we think of the Lost Lemon mine, we may never know if it actually existed. The North Saskatchewan River still shows some traces of gold today. But when we look at the area of southern Alberta, the area where we believe that would have been the location of the mine, it's not an area that we tend to associate with gold. Gold tends to be associated with hot rocks, formerly volcanic rocks, and there just are very few examples of that in that area. So if you talk to a lot of geologists and prospectors, they're not too confident that the mine actually exists. But the reality is, when you start exploring those valleys, there is so much wild country. It's vast, it's untouched, and as somebody who explores those trails, you realize very quickly that you might know 2 or 3 meters on either side of a trail, and beyond that, it's untouched. So it could easily remain hidden for a very, very long time.
Jack Lemon's lost mine is one of the greatest mysteries of Western Canada. Hopes dashed, facing financial ruin, nothing could deter these true treasure hunters. The mere possibility of striking gold, as slim as it may have been, was enough to fuel their dreams and their greed. Well before the gold rush began, and legends were born, stories circulated along the eastern coast of North America that pirates had commandeered rich ships headed for Europe. Even the infamous Captain Kidd was believed to have sailed along the coast of Nova Scotia. What if they had stopped along the way to hide the booty that they'd plundered? Just a fanciful tale, you say? Maybe not. In the summer of 1795, Daniel McGuinness headed out on his own to explore Oak Island, a small uninhabited island in Mahone Bay, southwest of Halifax, Nova Scotia. According to local rumors, the island was haunted by ghosts and other evil creatures. Walking carefully in the thick oak forest, the young explorer soon came upon a strange clearing where a sole oak tree stood proudly. Intrigued by the size of the clearing, young McGuinness noticed a round depression in the earth. He also saw a tackle block hanging from a branch of the oak tree, as if someone had buried a precious secret. A treasure, perhaps. Daniel McGuinness was convinced that the secret had to do with pirates and buccaneers. It was well known that pirates had used several of the islands in Mahone Bay to hide from their pursuers. McGuinness believed that the pirates had come to this island to hide their precious loot. Perhaps they'd used the large oak tree as a marker and decided to dig a hole at the base of the tree to bury their secret.
There it is.
The next morning, McGuinness returned to the island with two of his friends, John Smith and Anthony Vaughan. Armed with nothing more than shovels and buckets, the three young men began the most incredible treasure hunt in history in the mysterious and impenetrable Money Pit.
So the boys naturally thought that somebody had lowered a treasure, and the depression they were seeing was the earth settling in a big pit. Okay, nobody ever did any reasonable archaeological exploration of Oak Island. They just started digging frantically down this pit for the treasure that everybody seemed to assume was there.
We gotta get there.
After having dug down 3 meters, they came upon a platform made of oak planks.
I said we got it! We got it!
Now they were sure that someone had buried something in this hole. In the hopes of finding a chest full of gold and jewels, the young men tore at the platform. But to their great disappointment, all they found was clay.
Come on.
Over the summer, they dug down about only 30 feet, and then they had to give up. Basically, they couldn't get anybody to help them. Everybody thought it was a hoax, or that the island was haunted, various things like that. So nothing happened again until about 1803.
In 1803, the quest for the mysterious treasure continued. This time, a dozen or so workers joined the trio. They soon discovered another platform 3 meters further down. As they continued digging, they kept on finding more platforms and bits of wood at every 3 meters.
They went down to 90 feet, and at 90 feet, again, just with platforms every 10 feet, but then they came across a rock, a strange-looking rock with hieroglyphics on it.
Excited by this discovery, they tried to decipher the message written on it. Unable to interpret the meaning, they brought it up the shaft and continued digging. They quickly came upon what appeared to be another platform, but this time, the wood seemed to be softer. Had they finally reached the treasure? Night was falling, so the men decided to wait until Monday to finish off the job. Unfortunately for them, a surprise awaited them upon their return.
They came back and they found the money pit had filled up with water. It had been dry all this time, and it was filled with water from 30 feet from the top, 60 feet of water. And they tried bailing it, and they could, nothing happened. They bailed, and the water would just stay there, although it was going up and down with the tide. And then when they discovered it was salt water, and they realized that it was connected. Somehow the money pit was connected to the ocean.
The following spring, the treasure hunters began to dig another shaft. Their adventure ended abruptly when the entire shaft became flooded. The excavators decided to give up. What followed was a long succession of failures and disappointments.
In 1849, the Truro Company came back, a new syndicate, this time with more money and more people working on it, and they were successful to some degree in keeping the water level down, though not all the way down, and they set up a drilling platform, and they drilled down below 90 feet. And at one point, they were sure that they were drilling into chests because they were bringing up bits of wood, and also it sounded like the drill was going through loose metal. So, of course, they guessed that it must be coins, but none of those coins ever came up.
Even after boring a third shaft, Truro Alliance ran into the same problems with flooding. That was when they discovered the Money Pit's clever booby trap. Throwing dye into the main shaft, the laborers noticed that the dye came out in the ocean at two places, at two coves located at either end of the island. The designers of the shaft had apparently built two underground tunnels, which let water into the main shaft.
They then realized that they had to stop the water flow if they were going to get anywhere. And they built a cofferdam around Smith's Cove. And while they were building the cofferdam, that's when they discovered a whole series of culverts that were going out under the ocean and actually past their cofferdam. And these were man-made sort of rock cisterns, 5 of them. And they all came to one point, obviously leading to the Money Pit, which is about 500 feet away.
All of these unsuccessful attempts could no doubt have been avoided if in 1804 the workers had blocked the tunnels before attempting to remove the 9th platform at 27 meters. But who could have known? Unless that was the secret inscribed in hieroglyphics on the mysterious flat stone discovered just above this platform. Since then, dozens of treasure hunters have made their way to Oak Island. They all swore that they would find the buried treasure.
Truro Company tried several times to dig parallel pits to the Money Pit. The engineering didn't sound very sound because they thought, well, if they could get down below 90 feet and then tunnel laterally into the Money Pit, maybe they'd pull out the treasure that way. But of course, as soon as they got close to the Money Pit itself, they would be flooded out. And they were always, I guess, scampering up ladders and getting out. And so by the 1860s, there were probably 6 or 7 different pits around the Money Pit, all of them filled to sea level with water.
Since the new shafts being sunk were all flooding, a new approach had to be taken to prevent the water from reaching the treasure.
Various things were attempted to stop the water from getting to the Money Pit from Smith's Cove. Dynamiting, they sent dynamite charges along the line of the presumed tunnel. They built a cofferdam, actually a couple different cofferdams during the 18th century. 19th century. But these were usually washed away within a few weeks by storms and so on.
In August 1965, 4 treasure hunters drowned in the muddy waters of the Money Pit. But this tragedy did not discourage their successor. In 1971, a group of Montreal-based investors known as Triton Alliance lowered a waterproof camera 60 meters into the ground. The images revealed wooden chests and a skeleton's hand, a scary signature often associated with pirates. So, what is this mysterious treasure buried at the bottom of the Money Pit?
I am in a position to say that this Money Pit, located on the coast of Nova Scotia, could have been visited by Henry Sinclair, the Knights Templar, and the Knights Templars are said in various Grail romances to be the guardians of the Holy Grail.
Other theories say it's a UFO base. There's one theory that says all of Shakespeare's original manuscripts are buried under there as written by Francis Bacon. I have one fellow who still is in touch with me, who claims a bunch of Irish leprechauns live down there, and they have a little community and so on. The lost city of Atlantis might be down there, and the theories go on and on and on. The only theory that makes much sense to me, based on things that have been found on the island, such as old Spanish scissors, the coconut fiber, and so on, was that it could well have been a Spanish treasure, as the Spanish fleets that used to come up from the Caribbean, Mexico, and so on would follow the Gulf Stream on their way back to Spain, and they would pass within 200 to 300 miles of Oak Island as they turned eastward, heading home.
To date, the treasure hunt on Oak Island has cost more than $2 million, pools of sweat, and at least 5 lives. That's a steep price to pay when you stop to think that no object of value has ever been brought to the surface from the famous money pit.
During all of these years, there's been no real treasure found. It was rumored some gold links of a chain were found back in the 19th century, but there's no proof of that. However, a lot of interesting clues have been found. The Spanish scissors that were found by Triton, and they were definitely authenticated by the Smithsonian Institution to be Spanish-American in origin. The wood that's been carbon dated, the coconut fiber that is still being found today, and these clues are what keep people going, that there's got to be something down there, and because man certainly was working under that island, according to carbon dating, 400 or 450 years ago.
Despite all of the money spent on drilling ventures and all of the unsuccessful attempts, the mystery of the money pit remains as elusive as its alleged treasure. For more than 200 years, driven by an insatiable lust for gold, men have continued to dig beneath this island in Mahone Bay. Unlike other treasure hunts, the one at Oak Island is distinguished by the fact that the seekers know exactly where to look. They just have no idea what they're looking for. Fantastic encounters, enigmatic disappearances, strange truths, and fabulous legends. Maybe someone can finally reveal the truth behind these extraordinary mysteries. And maybe that someone is you. I'm Kenneth Welsh. Welcome to Northern Mysteries. Over the years, some strange things have become more acceptable due to the publicity they've received. Telling someone that you've seen a ghost is not nearly as threatening to your reputation as it may have been 30 years ago. On the other hand, some things are so bizarre that it's best not to talk about them at all. Several years ago, a couple from Quebec had a strange encounter just north of Ottawa. It took them a lot of courage to speak up about it. Canada is a land rich in myths and legends. province of Quebec abounds with stories of werewolves. The expression werewolf means man-wolf and refers to men who are capable of changing into monsters. It is also said that these monsters are practically immortal. In July 1766, the Quebec newspaper La Gazette announced that a werewolf was running wild in the county of Kamouraska. The newspaper also added that the beast was as dangerous as the one seen the year before in Gévaudan, France, which had terrorized the population to the point where the King of France, Louis XV, had dispatched his best marksman, Antoine de Beauterme, to kill it. By the time it died, the legendary beast had killed more than 120 victims.
We have lots and lots of legends in Quebec about werewolves, especially in a Catholic context, because what characterizes the werewolf in Quebec is that it's someone who didn't fulfill their Easter duties for 7 years in a row. What this means is they had to go to communion during Holy Week, or by the first Sunday after Easter at the latest. And bells were rung in a number of Quebec parish churches on the eve of this first Sunday after Easter, basically to mourn the deaths of those who had not fulfilled their Easter duties. So those who hadn't gone to communion underwent a transformation in the middle of the night, and they roamed around the countryside. People saw wolves. Father Lionel Groux told me himself that his father was once followed by a wolf, and that in order to get rid of it, he had to take a knife and stab it with it. And lo and behold, the man who appeared before his very eyes was naked, bleeding, and he said, "Don't tell another soul in the parish I was a werewolf. I've been condemned, and what you did let me change form, and thanks to you, I'm free at last."
While the full moon is generally associated with legends of werewolves, a couple from Blue Sea Lake, Quebec, met up with one of these creatures in complete darkness.
It was in November 1989. We were on our way back from seeing some friends. We were in the car, and then you couldn't see very far, right? And all of a sudden there was this weird kind of creature standing in front of the car.
It was around 10 p.m. that the Gagnon Bruyères ran into a creature beyond their wildest imagination.
We saw a creature covered with hair standing upright in the middle of the road. It was in the car's headlights. We could quite clearly see it was some kind of wolf standing on its hind legs, about 7 to 8 feet tall, with medium long fur, its teeth bared as though it was angry at being caught. I even saw its claws.
The creature seemed like something out of a horror movie. The couple couldn't believe their eyes. Suddenly, the beast leapt 15 meters and disappeared into the night.
No living human being could possibly have jumped from the middle of the road to the other side like that. That really knocked me for a loop. I asked my husband if he saw it too. I thought I was hallucinating, and so did he, because he told me, "I don't believe this. It's like those stories that our grandmothers told us about werewolves, about 7 or 8 feet tall. That's how they described them back then."
Superstitions brought over from Europe and terrifying legends of the devil and the wolf, known as the diabolical beast, are carried on from generation to generation through fairy tales. Faced with fright, both adults and children have had the same reaction: disbelief.
This can't be. This just can't be. That was the only thing running through my mind. It's like I was obsessed. I wanted to go back to see what had happened. My wife didn't. She screamed she wanted to go back home. I took her home. I went back to the field to get a better look, to scout around. Nothing. The next day, after work in the evening, I went back there to see if there were any tracks by the side of the road. There was absolutely nothing.
We talked to some of our friends about this thing that we had seen, and our friends said we were probably drinking that evening, or had taken something that made us hallucinate even. But I can't drink. I've never drunk. And as for drugs, I don't go near them. My husband doesn't either. The friends we went to see are also non-drinkers, so no way did we take anything. We were nowhere near being tired, so it wasn't even that late at night. But we couldn't make them believe us. That was the first and the last time we mentioned it to anyone.
Whether we believe them or not, many stories exist about encounters with werewolves, children being kidnapped by them and men turning into them. For instance, a hunter named Desjardins left for a hunting trip one night when there was a full moon and he was never seen again. Only his rifle and some coins were found on the ground at his campsite by volunteers who set out to look for him. But Quebec isn't the only area where werewolf sightings have been reported. Similar experiences that took place in Wisconsin are reported in the novel The Beast of Bray Road.
The Bray Road sightings were a collection of events where witnesses saw what they described as a tall, hairy, man-like creature with a head that was like a wolf or a German Shepherd dog in most cases. The descriptions were very consistent, and most of the time the people just had a very brief glimpse of it. And in almost every instance it would stare at them fiercely, which really scared them a lot, and as soon as they were sufficiently immobilized, it would escape into the underbrush or cornfield or whatever it was nearby. And these sightings have started several decades ago and continue to this present day. You know, I've had men who are hunters who are 6.5 feet tall themselves and brawny guys and used to seeing bears and other things out in the woods who just, you know, melted into a puddle with fear because they don't understand what this thing is. And a lot of people have used that word thing. They don't know what to call it. They see something that they can't understand, and that scares them as much as being menaced by a large hairy animal.
Legend had it that to turn into a werewolf, all a man needed to do, aside from skipping his religious studies, was to drink from the same river as a wolf, be bitten by a mad wolf, or simply eat wolfsbane. It was also said that one way to kill these practically immortal monsters was to shoot them with a silver bullet made from a sacred object, like a church crucifix.
In Quebec, the werewolf is a Catholic one, through and through. And then, bit by bit, because of the changing structure of religion, we started talking about it a little less. But we're dealing with an archetype here, a deep-seated archetype, our fear of sliding into a feral state, of being devoured by our animal nature, by the wolf. This whole thing comes to us from France, where the wolf terrorized the land. François Villon even mentioned it. He wrote about wolves entering Paris during times of famine. So we're talking about fear of the wolf and fear of becoming a wolf.
Except for the movies, Interest in werewolves has waned in modern times. But the fear aroused in us by these tales continues to haunt us at night. The devil has simply shape-shifted.
We might say that the werewolf is roaming around our cities now. He might not look like a wolf anymore, but he's the predator. He's the maniac. He's the madman. He's the psychopath. Therein lies the danger. Lurking behind this huge image of the werewolf, we might find representations of the mentally ill, of mental illness, which were misidentified back in those days, basically representations of all murderers.
The idea that these beings, half man, half wolf, could be living in rural areas of North America seems totally absurd. Scientists believe that reports of these creatures, apart from hoaxes and mass hysteria, can be explained away as the suffering of individuals from physical and mental disorders. Two illnesses that could be at the root of this strange behavior are Gunter's porphyria and lycanthropy.
Today, most of us live in cities. But what's really odd is that now this fantasy world is flowing in by another door, by urban legends. You're going to see the coming of a whole new fantasy world. I would say that fear is still at the heart of it. Fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear of the stranger, the fear of evil is always present. You never know, evil might be living next door. Besides, there are traces of evil in every human being. There are always traces of evil. Perhaps the werewolf is inside each one of us.
For most of us, werewolves, vampires, and other monstrosities are nothing more than fabrications designed to scare young children at night. But those who've been unfortunate enough to come face to face with one of these creatures have had their sense of reality reshaped completely. In his book, The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings, American author John Keel lists and describes oddities such as sea serpents, winged creatures, dragons, and werewolves. But his book doesn't contain any information on a strange creature seen by a group of children more than a quarter of a century ago in Coleraine, Quebec. It was September 1968 in a small cemetery in Coleraine, Quebec. Two men and a group of children marched forward determinedly. The group headed toward a huge rock at the back of the cemetery. This rock had an odd crack in it, forming a hole in the center, and it was this hole that interested the visitors. Paul Bogus, the eldest of the two adults, stepped into the cave made by this hole. For a moment, he stood and listened attentively for any sound. All he heard was silence, broken only by the sounds of the children speaking outside the cave. The children had sworn that their story was true, but it would take a lot more to convince the adults. After a few minutes, Paul came back out, angry at having fallen for the children's prank. His brother Claude decided to take the children back home. As Paul watched the group walk away, he heard a strange humming noise coming from inside the hole. Surprised, Paul went back into the cave. The noise was very distinct, as if someone was operating machinery inside the rock or under the ground. To make sure no one was playing a joke on him, he got out of the cave and walked all around it, but he didn't see anything that could explain the noise. The kids were right, he thought. There's something weird about this rock. In 1968, the small town of Saint-Joseph-de-Coleraine had less than 2,000 residents. But that summer, a few of the youngsters were about to experience something that would stay with them forever. It all began on the afternoon of August 29th. Denis Bogus and his brother Michel went to play in the cemetery, as they often did.
We often used to go and play near the boulder in the cemetery. There were some woods, and we used to play cowboys and hunt for squirrels there. The first time it happened was on a Thursday. Thursday, August 29th.
Without realizing it, the Bogus brothers had headed straight towards a huge rock. Just then, an apparition caught Denis' attention. An odd-looking creature was standing motionless on the rock near the cave, watching them.
We saw this thing standing there. It was like nothing we'd ever seen before. We watched it for a little while. After a moment, we got scared, and poof, he was gone, and we took off the other way.
The children ran home as fast as they could to tell their parents about what they'd seen.
You could describe the creature of Coleraine as a somewhat small being, with skin something like burnt snake skin or burnt scales, bald with rather large eyes, and also, as described by the children, with a very long beard. The being in question had the faculty of appearing and disappearing without moving. We never saw it move. It was like, now you see it, now you don't.
The next day, André Bogus and his uncle Pierre went back to the rock, looking for evidence that the creature existed. The children spent the morning exploring the cemetery and the neighboring woods, but they didn't find anything. At around 3:30 that afternoon, as they were getting ready to leave the cemetery, they saw the strange creature. It stared at the boys for a few seconds, then disappeared. Like when you turn off the TV, said one of the children.
We went back every day. We went at different times of the day, and we saw nothing. We could only see it between 3:30 and 4. All 6 of us went there on the 3rd day, and we all saw it again. We saw it at the base of the rock, in a spot where, if I'm facing the rock, it would be to my right. We saw it there fairly often. And then after that, we saw it next to the split in the boulder.
The same thing happened at the same time the next day. And on the 4th day, Pierre Bogus convinced his brother Georges to come with him to the cemetery that morning.
We got off our bikes and approached on foot. We heard something like a loud growling, like the growl of a bear. But there are no bears in the cemetery. We got really scared. I didn't know what was happening. We left our bikes there and we went back home. Then our mother told us to go get our bikes after dinner, and that we shouldn't play there anymore because there could be animals there. That surprised us because everybody in the village hung out in the cemetery.
Although the Coleraine creature had been appearing at regular intervals until that point, on the evening of September 1st, things took a wild and unexpected turn.
It was 7:40, 7:45 in the evening. But in September, it's still light out at 7. So the whole gang takes off for the cemetery again. We get about midway into the cemetery. One of us says, "I think I saw something pass in front of the moon." We go on, we keep going further into the cemetery. We get to about 50 feet from the base of the boulder. And that's where we saw it. After all these years, I still get goosebumps. We see this contraption. Then, when the machine gets over the boulder, something like 20 feet from the rock, our apparition shows up. Just like that, in the same position, his arms spread, and he's looking down at us like this.
André Bogus could see the creature clearly with his binoculars. It was staring in his direction. The children took turns passing the binoculars around so that everyone could see it. The sky was still light enough for the children to see that its skin was like waves, cresting and folding over lengthwise.
So the flying saucer went by. In any case, we called it a flying saucer. Then when it went by, when it flew directly above the being, he disappeared. Poof. Then the machine flew away and we lost sight of it.
That was the last time the creature was seen. And unfortunately, only the Bogus children saw the apparition on each of the 4 days. Their friends made fun of them and made them tell the story over and over. Many skeptics claimed that it was a prank, but even today, 35 years later, the Bogus boys are sticking to their story. As far as they're concerned, it really happened. They didn't just imagine it.
The first thing I asked my investigators to do was just to watch the children while they were talking. And these children were looking us straight in the eye. They were dead serious, with a kind of dramatic passion, so to speak, in their faces, in their voices, in the way they told the story, never needing to look at each other. This told me a lot. I said to myself, that's amazing. These children aren't lying. I can't prove it. But I can tell you, being a father myself, that these children aren't lying.
Statistics show that no matter where you live, someone has run into an unusual creature within a 300-kilometer radius of their home. Maybe someday, that person will be you. When the unknown shakes a person's confidence, their imagination can run wild. But true mysteries that defy all explanation may be doorways to the fantastic realm of knowledge. I'm Kenneth Welsh. Welcome to Northern Mysteries. Over the years, the UFO phenomenon has been associated with sightings of unusual objects. If we look more closely, we can see that the link established between UFOs and these strange objects is often based on a lack of proof rather than a show of proof. But when it comes to strange phenomena, the absence of proof is not a proof of absence. The meeting was to take place at a Victoria shopping center. 2 days earlier, Grant Breland had seen a UFO and talked about it on his CB radio. He learned that another man in his area had also seen the phenomenon, and the two men agreed to meet to compare notes on what they'd seen. But the man Grant was supposed to meet wasn't coming. He had broken his arm. Breland suddenly had a weird feeling. He looked around, and all he could see were two men who appeared to be identical twins, waiting around.
What is your name? Where do you live? What is your number?
The men didn't ask him for his phone number. They asked him for his number, as if they meant some sort of identification number. watched the two men as they walked away. Suddenly he heard a voice as if someone was whispering behind him. He turned, but no one was there. When he looked back, the two men had disappeared, as if they had passed through an invisible wall. Although it may seem surprising, Grant Breland's encounter was not unique. Since the 1950s, several witnesses and investigators of UFO phenomena claim to have been visited by these mysterious individuals dressed in dark suits.
Well, I think the Men in Black stories occurred almost right from the beginning, early 1950s on, and sort of intertwined with other stories of alien encounters. It's just a bit more sinister type of encounters. There's a lot of, in the 1950s, the good alien type that met with people, and the Men in Black would be the sort of the sinister, sort of evil alien that wants the story to be covered up. So I think it sort of intermingles. It's been around the whole time that ufology has been around.
The history of the Men in Black goes back to Connecticut in 1952. That was the year that Albert Bender founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau, an organization dedicated to studying UFOs. It was immediately successful. Then, in the fall of 1953, Bender told members that he was dropping out of the organization. And within a few days, it was nothing more than a vague memory. 3 years later, in a book called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, Bender's friend Gray Barker explained why his colleague had given up the study of UFOs. Bender had admitted to him that he'd been visited by 3 men dressed in black, who had warned him to back down before things took a turn for the worse. Supposedly, these mysterious individuals visit witnesses and investigators to let them know that they are being watched.
Yes, I believe the government has used the MIB phenomena to intimidate witnesses, but I don't think it's a major type of thing. I think they have tried to intermingle at times, to use the phenomena to intimidate witnesses, to try to throw people off, to confuse people.
I think the government's very interested in UFOs. I think we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate. I can't find much in the way of validity to the Men in Black stories. That they want to know what's going on, sure. That intelligence agencies have had this on their agenda for a very long time, no question. But I can't make a big deal out of Men in Black. I see no reason to think that the Men in Black were aliens or really government employees either. I think it's vivid imaginations. I think the stories get embroidered and embroidered. I don't doubt that there are people on the government side who are interested in what's going on. But I have no reason to accept any of those stories about aliens and Men in Black.
In 1978, Patricia Hayes was an investigator for the Canadian UFO Research Network. She had a strange visit that she will never forget.
On April the 25th, 1978, I was about to go on the JC Talk Show in CJCS in Stratford, Ontario. And I was at home going over UFO sizes, shapes, speeds, because it was a call-in with questions and I wanted to make sure that I knew the answers for that. And one of the things I was reading about as well was MIBs. I was familiar with them. And I heard a knock on the door. And when I opened the door, I stepped back in surprise.
Yes?
Would you like a photograph of your family or children?
He spoke in that really broken, insanely mixed up manner. When the man in black visited me, afterwards I did discover that some of the files that I had were missing. A lot of people believe that MIB are aliens. They can be humanoid. Some people believe that they are government agents. They show up after sightings, they confiscate, they threaten, they intimidate. I don't know what they are, but I can tell you that when you're in the presence of one, you will never forget them.
All I can really say is my personal experience. I've been at this for almost 30 years. I've had 2 cases where I've talked to people who've been involved in Men in Black. In both cases, it appeared to me that it was alien. It was not government. There's a story about whether it's government, whether it's alien. In both cases, it appeared to be alien.
It's true that sightings of these men in black seem to coincide with sightings of other seemingly inexplicable phenomena. On October 8th, 1981, Hannah McRoberts accidentally photographed an odd silver-colored disc near Kelsey Bay in the northern part of Vancouver Island. The photograph, which has undergone much analysis, is now considered to be one of the most credible in the history of UFOs. What's interesting is that Hannah McRoberts took her photo just 5 days after Grant Breland's UFO sighting, and 3 days after his strange encounter with the disturbing men in black at the Victoria Shopping Centre. Just a coincidence? Despite the interest piqued by these men in black, no investigator has ever succeeded in determining their identity, if they really do exist, that is. There are no photographs, documents, or film of these curious individuals on file. If these men in black do exist, they are truly masters of the art of being discreet. In the 1950s and 60s, governments were known to be interested in UFOs. This interest, often shrouded in mystery, sometimes resulted in vague incidents being reported to the public, which may explain the origin of rumors about conspiracies and men in black. In Canada, the most famous of these incidents was the Michalak affair. At around 5:30 a.m. on May 20th, 1967, Stefan Michalak was getting ready to leave his motel just off the Trans-Canada Highway in the woody area of White Shell Provincial Park, Manitoba. Although he worked as a mechanic for a Winnipeg-based company, his real passion was prospecting. On this glorious Saturday morning, he was planning to hike up to Falcon Lake, near the Ontario border, to do a bit of exploring. Early that morning, he found several rocks that seemed to be rich in quartz. He stopped in this spot and looked around. Suddenly, close to 12:30, he heard an odd humming sound. Looking up, he saw 2 oblong shapes with a dome on top, heading toward him. One of the objects slowly lowered to the ground, a few meters from the prospector, while the second one continued heading west. From up close, the ship looked more like a disc than a cigar. While it had appeared reddish in color in the sky, it now appeared to be gray, with a polished metal finish. Michalak observed and drew the object for just over half an hour. This mysterious encounter in May 1967 would mark Stefan Michalak for the rest of his life. Stefan Michalak moved to Canada in 1948 after having survived the harsh war years in his native Poland. In 1967, he was working as an industrial mechanic at a cement factory. Michalak was a strict, honest man and a hard worker who wasn't in the habit of making up stories about beings from outer space.
My father had absolutely no idea what he saw. Not a clue.
At first, Michalak thought he was looking at a prototype for an American military aircraft. Suddenly, a door opened on the side of the craft, like a lens opening on a camera. Then Michalak heard noises and what appeared to be voices.
Anybody there?
When he heard these voices, he became braver and figured that perhaps these Americans needed some help, so he walked up and called to them, "Hey, Yankee boys, do you need some help? I'll give you a hand. I can fix your craft." But then the voices became silent, and it occurred to him perhaps these were not Americans. So being multilingual, he called out in Russian, the same thing, but there was still no response. He walked up to the side of the object, which was about 15 feet in height. He poked his head inside the doorway, and he could see an array of flashing lights, much like computers did in the 1960s and 70s. And he didn't see anything more in terms of detail, but noticed that the sides, the walls, were very thick on this craft from the doorway.
He heard sounds. What these sounds were to this day, he won't say, because he doesn't know. It was the sound of whirring, and the sound of clicking, and the sound of ticking and talking and little noises.
The door suddenly shut. The whole object began to rotate, and there was a grill, an array of holes right in front of him, out of which a blast of hot gas suddenly shot out, knocking him to the ground, setting his clothes on fire. The object rose into the air and flew away.
When the craft took off and he was hit in the chest with a blast of hot gases, he was in considerable pain. But more importantly, he was reacting to this burn. When people get burned, it's pain, it's local, you bandage it or whatever, and it's fine. But he was vomiting, he was nauseated, head was spinning. So all of the effects that you would get if you had, I don't know, maybe an allergic reaction.
On his way back to the motel, Michalak didn't feel very well. He had pains and felt nauseous, and was constantly fighting to stay conscious. His senses were filled with an unpleasant odor that he couldn't seem to shake. The smell of a hot engine mixed with sulfur and ozone. It took him 2 hours to get back to the motel where he had been staying. Thinking that he must be contaminated, Michalak avoided contact with other people. When he got to his room, he was told that the nearest clinic was in Kenora, 70 kilometers to the west. Michalak decided not to go to the clinic. He preferred to get back to Winnipeg as soon as possible and see a doctor there. He called his wife and asked her to have their son pick him up at the bus station around 10 p.m.
It's me.
His son met him and took him to a hospital where he was treated for what he described was burns from an aircraft. However, he had second and third degree burns on his chest, but on his stomach there were some very unusual welts, some sort of chemical burns as they were later described.
They treated him for burns, but they couldn't come up with, why is he sick? Why is he not, why is he not responding? Why does he smell like this? Why does he act like this? They had no idea.
The physician treated him for the superficial injuries and sent him home, but then Michalak began getting very ill.
In the following weeks, Stefan Michalak's life turned into a nightmare. His health did not improve, and he lost 10 kilograms of body weight. He saw his family doctor, who referred him to a dermatologist and then an allergist. Unfortunately, none of the doctors seemed able to pinpoint the cause of their patient's symptoms. At the same time, Michalak had to face another aspect of the nightmare.
After my dad finally told the story, and his first thought, being the man that I described, his first thought is, if this is dangerous, I got to tell somebody. If this is out there, I got to tell somebody. Who? Who do I tell? It turned out that there was a writer for the Winnipeg Tribune newspaper who sat with him and got the whole story. And then the story hit the newspaper. And that's when all hell broke loose. I mean, forget it. Our lives were no longer the same after that. Everybody came involved. The Royal Canadian Air Force got involved. The RCMP got involved. They showed up every day, all the time, odd hours of the day, asking the same questions, tell us the story all over again. And Dad couldn't believe what he had started. And he, to this day, and well, till he died, believed he should have kept his mouth shut.
Michalak also had to deal with media hounds from around the world who were using every means imaginable to reach the man who had touched a flying saucer.
Dad had told the story 1,000,000 times and was tired and said, this is nuts. My mother especially really hated the media circus.
Mr. Michalak, please, come on. Just 1 or 2 questions, that's all.
So Dad wrote a book. It was a little, I think, 30-page little softcover document. It was printed by a friend of the family kind of thing. And he says, look, to my mother, he says, when they come to the door and they want to hear the story again, hand them the book and get them out of here. And people said, oh, you wrote a book. Oh, you must have made money. Didn't make a dime. In fact, spent money. But what he wanted was peace and quiet.
Of all the investigative reports written about the Michalak case, the one written by Sergeant Biskey has to be the most far-fetched.
Sergeant Biskey of the Air Force did believe that there was a possibility that Michalak had hoaxed this. In fact, one statement was that perhaps Michalak was causing some trouble in the bush and was having a barbecue and had fallen on the barbecue, and that gave him this unusual pattern of burns. However, an examination of the burns would suggest the opposite would have occurred, that there wouldn't be the pattern of checkerboard. You would have the lines from the barbecue, so that didn't seem to make any sense whatsoever.
Nearly a year later, he was at work and he collapsed. And he began to swell up like a balloon. They took him to the hospital. They suggested it was some sort of an allergic reaction. And the spots began to reappear on his chest.
At the end of his rope, Michalak paid to have himself checked by specialists at the famous Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
I'm always tired.
They came to the conclusion that he was suffering from radiation of an unknown nature.
There was no explanation for his illness. The doctors down there were baffled, and yet the psychiatric assessment said exactly to the point that he was not prone to making up stories. He was very down to earth and very sincere. So there was no explanation for his physical ailments nor for what he claimed had happened to him. It was a mystery.
Until his death in 1999, Stefan Michalak never changed a single detail in his description of the incident. Although he became well known because of his story, he never got anything out of it. On the contrary, he was ridiculed for years when all he wanted to do was warn his fellow Canadians of a possible threat.
One can suggest that he fabricated the entire hoax, but it's a very complicated hoax and one that would require some extraordinary planning and deception, and I do not see the evidence for that.
If it is something local, if it is something domestic, fine. It doesn't matter. If it's an alien craft, fine. It also doesn't matter. What mattered to us was this happened to our father. This was our man. This guy was from our family. That mattered to us more than what was this.
The Michalak affair is, without a doubt, the most sensational UFO story in Canada. Even today, Questions remain as to the nature of the object observed by Stefan Michalak. Up until his death in 1999, the prospector continued to believe that what he'd seen was perhaps some sort of secret prototype. The problem is that no such prototype has ever resurfaced in the world's leading military forces since it was observed in 1967. What if it was something else, entirely different?
When the unknown shakes a person's confidence, their imagination can run wild. But true mysteries that defy all explanation may be doorways to the fantastic realm of knowledge.